The curse of the oak door. It didn't end with a cry, but with a dull, resonant sound that echoed like thunder in the winter night. The slam of the heavy oak door. 3 years. That's how long it took for Chloe's life to shatter and be rebuilt in solitude, carrying a secret that Ethan's pride never allowed him to know. On that cold Newport night, he had stood stiffly beneath the chandelier, his dark eyes set in stone, delivering a cold, final command. Don't come back. Chloe walked away, her heels lost and lonely on the thin layer of snow covering the driveway of the luxurious mansion. She was no longer the loving woman he had driven away, but a figure carrying frozen grief. But fate holds a cruel irony. Even though he had shut that door with absolute finality, he had unknowingly left behind an unbreakable promise inside. 3 years later, on the pristine white snow of a remote Colorado mountain town, that door of destiny rattled open once more. This time, Ethan Hale didn't see the woman he had cast off, but 2 tiny, innocent lives. Twin girls were laughing and throwing snowballs, but in their deep brown eyes, he recognized a chilling truth. They carried the exact eyes that had caused him to utter the curse years ago. His pride had slammed the door on love, but her secret demanded it be opened. And in that moment, Ethan knew he had to confront not just the past, but the fallout of a decision that had changed everything. The echo of the slammed door. He told her never to come back and slammed the door. 3 years later, he saw her again, this time with twin girls who had his exact eyes. The night was sharp with a New England winter chill, the kind that bites the skin and drags the silence in its wake. Inside the grand house, the marble floors reflected the gleam of the gilded chandeliers, but no amount of light could soften the coldness in Ethan's expression. He stood straight in the doorway, his brown hair falling slightly over his forehead, his dark eyes as unyielding as stone. Facing him, Chloe's blue eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She was trembling, her breath fogging in the frigid air that seeped in from the open door. For a fleeting instant, she thought he might relent, that the man she had loved with such intensity would remember the promises he once whispered late at night. But instead, his voice came out like a blade, sharp, deliberate, final. Don't come back. The words wounded her more cruelly than the cold ever could. She opened her mouth, desperate to beg, to explain, to fight for the life they had shared. But the look in his eyes silenced her. There was no room for her words, no crack in his armor, only the pride and the rage that shut her out. He pressed his hand against the heavy oak door, and she knew with certainty that the moment he closed it, everything would change forever. Chloe's heart pounded as she backed away, her heels crunching softly against the thin layer of frost that had begun to settle on the Newport mansion steps. The weight of his rejection pressed against her chest until she felt she might break right there, in the darkness. She had imagined the anger. She had even imagined the disappointment, but nothing could have prepared her for the chilling void of his contempt. He wasn't yelling or raging, and somehow that made it worse. His calm told her he had already decided she was nothing more than a closed chapter in the history of his life. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in her bones. She stood motionless on the stone steps, staring at the polished brass handle gleaming faintly in the dim light. The barrier between her and the man she once believed would never turn his back on her. The world around her was silent, as if even the night was holding its breath in sympathy. Snowflakes began to fall, slow at first, then faster, dusting her hair and coat, but she didn't move. She felt as though she were frozen in place, a figure abandoned in a painting of heartbreak. Finally, her strength waning, she turned. Every step down the grand driveway felt like moving further into exile. The wind howled against her, whispering his words over and over, tormenting her with the memory. Don't come back. She wrapped her arms around herself as if she could hold her heart together, but nothing stopped the spread of the cracks. When she reached the edge of the property, she looked back one last time. The house loomed against the night sky, its windows glowing with a warmth she no longer had a right to claim. She whispered a goodbye, though no one could hear it, and in that moment, she vowed she would never let him see her shattered. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that she was already carrying a piece of him that no slammed door could ever erase. As the snow thickened around her, Chloe walked into the unknown, tears freezing on her cheeks, unaware that the secret she carried would one day force open the very door he had closed so firmly against her. The secret and survival. Chloe left the mansion that night with the snow piling on her shoulders, the echo of Ethan's words following her like a curse. The city lights glittered faintly in the distance, sharp against the winter darkness, but none of it mattered, for she felt as though the world had collapsed beneath her feet. She rented a tiny room above a bakery in a forgotten corner of Boston, a space that smelled vaguely of yeast and sugar, but whose walls were thin and whose heat failed with unreliable radiators. It wasn't the life she had envisioned when she met Ethan, nor the dream of security and companionship she had clung to, yet it became her refuge when she had nowhere else to go. Each night she lay awake listening to the wind press against the window and relived the sound of the door closing in her mind, trying to understand how love could morph into contempt so quickly. Weeks passed in a haze of pain and fatigue until she discovered the truth that changed her world again. She was expecting his children. The first time she realized it, her hands shook so violently that she dropped the small ceramic cup she was holding, watching it shatter on the kitchen floor. She pressed both palms to her abdomen, her breath caught in her throat, and for the first time since Ethan had cast her out, she felt something other than despair. Fear washed over her, fear of raising a child alone, of bearing the burden of responsibility without support. But beneath that fear flickered an ember of purpose. She would not crumble, not when 2 lives now depended on her. She whispered to herself in the quiet hours of the night that she would hold on, that she would build a life from ashes if she had to, and that no cruel words from Ethan could take away the love she already felt for the tiny hearts beating within her. Her pregnancy was not easy. She worked long hours despite the exhaustion, waiting tables until her feet ached, cleaning offices after hours, and taking any odd job she could find. The money she earned barely covered rent and food, but she stretched every coin, learning to live with little so she could prepare for the lives to come. She kept her secret close, telling no one the identity of the father, for she couldn't bear the questions, the pity, or the judgment. She told herself she didn't need Ethan's wealth or his name, that her daughters would grow up knowing love rather than pride and cruelty. But late at night, when she felt the twins stir inside her and the silence press too heavily on her chest, she admitted in whispers to the darkness that she wished things had been different. When the twins were born on a cold morning almost a year later, Chloe wept as she held them for the first time. 2 tiny, perfect, identical girls with soft brown hair framing their delicate faces and deep brown eyes that so clearly mirrored Ethan that Chloe's heart ached with every glance. She named them Scarlett and Isabel, names she had whispered during sleepless nights while imagining their faces. Holding them, she felt the strength she had doubted surge through her. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment of fear was worth it, for they were hers. The world outside the hospital room could still be cruel, but within her arms was the warmth of a family she vowed she would never let go. Their father's eyes. The first few years were grueling, filled with endless nights of crying, fevers, and scraped knees, but Chloe carried it all with quiet determination. She learned to sew so she could mend their clothes when they tore them climbing or running. She bartered with neighbors, trading her time for childcare so she could work extra shifts. She read to them by candlelight when the power was cut because she couldn't afford the bill, turning those moments into games so the girls never felt the weight of poverty. To them, she was mother and father, shield and comfort. And though she often collapsed into bed with an aching body, she found joy in their laughter, their shared secrets, and their unwavering trust in her. Yet, even in the beauty of motherhood, Ethan's shadow persisted. Scarlett's serious gaze reminded her of him lost in thought, and Isabel's mischievous smile carried an echo of the charm that once melted her heart. Sometimes she would catch her breath when one of them turned her head a certain way, and it was as though he were standing in front of her again, not with anger, but with all the tenderness she remembered. She hated those moments because they made her wonder what might have been if he hadn't slammed that door, if he had chosen trust over pride. But she forced herself to let those thoughts fade. Ethan was a part of the past, and she had no room for him in the fragile life she had built. Chloe reminded herself daily that her daughters were her purpose now, her reason to get up when everything in her body told her to collapse. She whispered promises to them at night, promises that they would never feel abandoned, that they would never hear words like, "Don't come back," because she would always fight for them. She believed those promises with every fiber of her being. But what she didn't know was that fate had its own plans, and the man who had slammed the door on her life was already walking paths that would one day lead him back to hers, forcing her to confront the very secret she had fought so hard to keep hidden. The return. The winter morning in the Colorado mountains held a sharp brilliance, the kind that made every detail glisten as if the world had been carved from glass and silver. Chloe wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck as she stood outside the small, rustic diner where she had been working since the fall, the warm scent of bread and coffee wafting into the frigid air. Scarlett and Isabel were bundled in matching coats, their brown eyes wide with delight as they chased each other in the snow, their boots crunching rhythmically on the frozen ground. Chloe's laugh floated out as she called to them, warning them not to go too far, though her tone held more love than severity. For a brief moment, everything felt secure, as if life had finally settled into a rhythm she could rely on. Then, across the road, the sound of a car door closing shattered the silence. A sleek black SUV stood out against the snow, its polished surface gleaming in the morning light. Chloe paid it no mind at first. Tourists often came to the mountains this time of year, but the moment her eyes lifted and settled on the man who stepped out, her heart lurched violently in her chest. Ethan. He was older now, but the years had only carved his features into sharper, more defined lines. His brown hair, flecked with a touch of frost, caught the light, and his deep brown eyes, once full of coldness, scanned the scene with a distant focus. For one suspended heartbeat, Chloe waited for him not to see her, for fate to show mercy and let him pass by. But his gaze didn't glide past her. It stopped, fixed, and then dropped to the two small figures playing in the snow. Scarlett's serious face was alight with laughter as she flung a snowball at Isabel, who ducked with quick grace before retaliating, both girls shrieking with delight. They were perfect reflections of each other, their matching brown eyes shining, their hair catching the sunlight in the exact shade that Ethan had carried since he was young. The color drained from Ethan's face, his entire body freezing as the truth hit him. He didn't need to ask. He knew. Chloe's body went rigid, her arms crossing instinctively as she stepped forward, placing herself between Ethan and the twins, though they hadn't yet noticed him. Her breath fogged heavily in the cold air as the memories of the past surged up. The sound of a door slamming shut, the finality of his words, "Don't come back," still ringing after all these years. She wanted to run, to scoop her daughters up and disappear into the safety of the tiny home she had built, but her feet refused to move. Her eyes met his, and time seemed to fold in on itself. Pulling her back to the night everything fell apart. Ethan finally found his voice, though it was rough and uneven, stripped of its former authority. "Chloe," he breathed, almost disbelievingly, as if her presence in this place defied all reason. His eyes flicked once more to the girls, and he stumbled a step forward, his hands half raised, as if reaching for something he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch. "Are they?" The words caught in his throat, but the truth already hung heavy in the air, undeniable in every shared feature, every mirrored expression. Chloe's heart clenched as she pressed her arms to her chest, her voice tougher than she felt inside. "Your words were clear," she said, forcing steel into her tone even though her hands were shaking. "You told me not to come back, and I didn't." For a moment, the snow seemed to fall harder, as if the world itself sought to shield her and her daughters from the weight of this confrontation. She wanted to turn and walk away, to erase this collision of past and present before it could unravel the life she had fought to build. But Ethan's face stopped her. His eyes weren't filled with the same cold contempt she remembered. Instead, they were undisguised, raw, shaking with a vulnerability she had never seen from him before. The twins, oblivious to the storm brewing, finally noticed the man standing a short distance away. Isabel, bold as ever, called out, "Mommy, who's that?" "Mommy!" Scarlett, more cautious, moved closer to her mother, her small hand sliding into Chloe's coat pocket for reassurance. Chloe's breath hitched at the sound of Isabel's voice, for in it, Ethan surely heard the echo of himself. She could see his hands tremble, see the raging battle behind his eyes, as he absorbed the sight of the girls who were undeniably his. For Chloe, the moment was suffocating. She had spent 3 years building walls, convincing herself that he was gone for good, that the past no longer held the power to touch her. Yet here he was, staring at the daughters he had unknowingly left behind, and she knew the fragile balance of her life was about to shatter. She couldn't yet fathom what would come next, whether Ethan would fight to reclaim what he had lost, or if she would be strong enough to resist the pull of the man who once destroyed her. All she knew was that nothing would ever be the same. The confrontation and the promise. Ethan stood in the snow as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet, his eyes locked on the twins with a mixture of awe and devastation. He wanted to speak, but the words were lodged in his throat, tangled in a regret that had been festering for years. Chloe's face was pale against the winter light, her arms wrapped around herself, her entire posture screaming that she would not allow him any closer. The girls, still curious, stayed at her side, their questions bubbling in tiny voices that Chloe silenced with a quiet command to go back to playing. They obeyed reluctantly, though Scarlett's eyes lingered on Ethan with suspicion, while Isabel gave him a bold, lingering look before skipping off. That brief exchange left Ethan reeling, for he recognized himself in Isabel's spark and Scarlett's thoughtful caution. Every second in their presence was both a revelation and a punishment. When Chloe finally spoke again, her words carried the sharp edge of years of pain. She told him he had no right to be there, no right to look at the daughters who carried his eyes, no right to intrude on a life he had chosen to abandon. Ethan flinched as if each word struck him physically, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he forced himself to face her, his voice low and ragged as he admitted he was wrong. He confessed that his pride had blinded him that night, 3 years ago, that anger and mistrust had drowned out reason. He had believed lies, suspicions, shadows that should never have superseded the love they once shared. His hands shook as he spoke, and for the first time Chloe saw the cracks in the armor of the man she once knew as unyielding. But her fury was not so easily disarmed. She moved closer, her blue eyes blazing, and demanded to know where he had been when she was facing nights of exhaustion so deep she thought her body would collapse. She told him of the nights the girls were sick with fever, and she sat awake for hours, praying they would make it, of the mornings she went to work hungry because she'd given them her last meal, of the endless moments of solitude when she carried the burden of parenthood alone. Her voice broke as she told him that while she sacrificed everything, he had lived comfortably, untouched by the reality of the family he had discarded. Ethan could not look away, even as her words carved him with ruthless precision. He realized that nothing he had endured in his own years of regret compared to the suffering she had faced in silence. He tried to reach for her, but she drew back sharply, her expression warning him not to cross the fragile border between them. Yet, he pushed forward with his words, desperate to be heard. He told her there hadn't been a single day he hadn't thought of her, though his pride had kept him chained to his own lies. He admitted he had drowned himself in work, in wealth, in distraction. Yet nothing silenced the echo of that door slamming shut. Nothing dulled the image of her face as she stood in the cold that night. His voice cracked as he said he didn't deserve forgiveness, but he couldn't ignore the truth standing in front of him. The girls were his, and he wanted, no, needed, the chance to know them, to protect them, to give them what he had once refused to do. Chloe listened, but her heart was at war inside her. A part of her wanted to scream at him to leave, to fade back into the life of riches he belonged to. But another part of her trembled with the memory of the man she once loved, the man who hadn't been entirely erased by the betrayal. She thought of Scarlett and Isabel, of their questions about a father, of the way their eyes sometimes searched hers, as if trying to fill a gap they couldn't name. Her instinct was to shield them, to prevent them from being hurt as she had been. But she could no longer deny the truth. The bond between father and daughters was already visible, as undeniable as the blood they shared. The conversation stretched on until the cold bit their faces, and the girls grew impatient waiting. At last, Chloe said softly that she didn't trust him, that she couldn't simply let him into their lives after years of silence. But she also conceded that the choice was no longer hers alone. Scarlett and Isabel had a right to know the man who gave them life, and she wouldn't steal that from them, no matter her anger. Her terms were clear. If he wanted to be present, he would have to earn it with actions, not words. He would have to prove he was no longer the man who turned his back on them. Ethan accepted her terms with a solemn nod, his chest heavy with the weight of both hope and guilt. For the first time in years, he felt that he had been given a chance, however fragile and uncertain. Chloe turned to collect her daughters, her voice softening as she called to them, but Ethan stayed rooted in the snow, watching the three of them together. The family he had once discarded. He realized in that moment that no amount of wealth or success could compare to what stood before him. For the first time, he was determined to fight. Not for power, not for pride, but for the love of the woman he had lost and the daughters he never knew he had. The daily return. Actions, not words. Ethan returned the next day, not with grand gestures or expensive gifts, but with a quiet determination that surprised Chloe. He stood outside the diner where she worked, waiting for her shift to end, his expensive coat dusted with snow and his hair damp from the storm that had settled on the mountains. When Chloe saw him through the glass, she felt her chest tighten with anger and discomfort. Yet there was something in his stillness that made her hesitate. He was no longer the commanding man she remembered from the past, giving orders and demanding attention. He seemed almost small against the world, humbled in a way she never thought possible. She wanted to send him away immediately, to tell him he had no place near the fragile life she had built. But when she stepped outside and saw Scarlett and Isabel run toward him with innocent curiosity, she couldn't deny them the chance to see who he truly was. A father's first steps. The initial attempts at connection were clumsy. Ethan knelt in the snow, his expensive gloves discarded as he awkwardly helped the girls build a snowman. Isabel giggled at its lopsided construction, playfully scolding him for not packing the snow hard enough, while Scarlett hovered at Chloe's side, watching warily as if trying to decide if he was safe. Chloe noted the way Ethan looked at them, not just with fascination, but with reverence, as if every second in their presence was an undeserved gift. That evening, when Chloe tried to dismiss the encounter as a passing indulgence, Scarlett surprised her by whispering that she liked the way the man listened to Isabel's chatter. The simple comment unnerved Chloe more than she wanted to admit, for she had spent years preparing to keep him at a distance, never imagining her daughters would embrace him so readily. Ethan began to return regularly. Sometimes he brought groceries, simple things like bread, milk, and fresh fruit. And Chloe hated herself for noticing how much it eased her burden. Other times, he carried children's books tucked under his arm, reading to the twins in a voice so steady and warm that Chloe, listening from the kitchen, felt something twist painfully inside her. He wasn't trying to overwhelm them with wealth, nor was he attempting to win Chloe over with apologies. He seemed bent on showing her and the girls, day by day, that he was willing to work for their trust, to be present without expectation. He would sit at their small table, hunching his shoulders to fit in the cramped space, patiently helping Scarlett trace letters in a notebook, while Isabel climbed onto his lap, demanding another story. Chloe tried to resist the pull of these moments, but at night, when the girls were asleep, she found herself staring at the ceiling, reliving the sound of their laughter with him. She remembered how different it had been 3 years ago, when his voice had been a weapon sharp enough to cut her down. Now, that same voice carried a sweetness she didn't recognize. The tale of imperfection one afternoon, after a long day when Chloe came home exhausted, she found him already there, sitting on the floor with the twins as they painted pictures on scraps of paper. He looked up, his hands and shirt streaked with swaths of color, and smiled at her sheepishly. Something inside her fractured at the sight because it was so ordinary, so human, so far removed from the cold businessman who once slammed a door in her face. Later that night, when she tried to scold him for overstepping by coming to the apartment without her, his only response was an apology followed by a quiet confession. He wanted them to know they could count on him to be there, even when life was messy and imperfect. For Chloe, trust remained the hardest barrier. She couldn't forget the nights she held her feverish daughters alone, whispering desperate prayers because she had no one to lean on. She couldn't erase the memory of hunger gnawing at her stomach while she pretended not to be hungry so the twins could eat. Those scars didn't heal easily, and she reminded Ethan of them every time he tried to apologize. But instead of defending himself or making excuses, he listened. He absorbed every word, every accusation, as if he believed he deserved every one of them. One night, after Scarlett had fallen asleep with her head on his shoulder as he read, Ethan lingered in the quiet apartment, reluctant to leave. Chloe, standing in the kitchen, felt the weight of his presence press against her resolve. She asked him flatly what he wanted, why he was here, why he was suddenly willing to sacrifice his empire to sit in a cramped apartment with paint on his shirt. His answer came softly, without hesitation. He told her that wealth and success had never filled the void that had haunted him since the night he left her, and that seeing his daughters had shown him what truly mattered. He admitted that he was terrified of losing them again, but he would rather fight for them and be rejected than live another day pretending he didn't care. Chloe didn't answer, for the ache in her chest was too intense. She only nodded, and told him that if he truly wanted to stay, he would have to prove it not for weeks, not for months, but for years. She told him that promises meant nothing without consistency, and that she would not forgive him easily, no matter how hard he tried. He accepted her challenge with a solemn look, his eyes steady even as hers glistened with the weight of old hurts. As the snow piled up outside, and the mountains seemed to close in with silence, Chloe realized her life had entered a new, fragile, and uncertain chapter. She didn't know if she could ever trust Ethan again, but she couldn't deny the way her daughters already looked at him, nor the way her heart betrayed her in the moments when his voice softened or his laughter filled the room. She told herself she was only enduring his presence for the sake of Scarlett and Isabel, but deep down, in the corners of her heart, she tried to ignore. She felt the dangerous flicker of hope. The storm takes root. Winter in the Colorado mountains was often beautiful, but it also carried a sense of isolation that sometimes unsettled Chloe. The small town where she lived was quiet, with only a handful of shops and the steady trickle of tourists who came to ski or spent cozy weekends by the fire. Life had adopted a new rhythm, with Ethan lurking at the edges, slowly working his way into the world she had built with Scarlett and Isabel. The girls had begun to expect him, their faces lighting up when they heard his knock on the door, their voices calling, "Daddy," with an ease that made Chloe's chest ache. She still told herself to be careful, to guard her heart. But seeing the twins lean into him, their giggles echoing in the tiny apartment, she sometimes forgot to keep her walls high. However, just as things began to feel almost safe, the past she thought she had buried returned in the most haunting way. Ethan's business life was never simple. Over the years, his position had earned him powerful allies, but also dangerous enemies. While he had stepped back from the cutthroat pace of the city to be here with Chloe and the girls, not everyone in his world wanted him to find peace. Unbeknownst to Chloe, rumors of his sudden disappearing act and secrets had already circulated among people eager to use his vulnerability. The truth crashed into their lives one evening as Chloe walked home with the twins from the diner after her shift. Snow was falling thickly, muffling their footsteps as the girls chanted a silly rhyme, their small gloved hands laced in hers. She was just beginning to relax when she noticed the dark vehicle parked down the street. The sight unsettled her, and her grip on the girls' hands tightened. The car doors opened, and two men stepped out, their faces shadowed by heavy hoods. They didn't belong in this quiet town. Chloe felt her heart clench with fear as they moved toward her, their steps deliberate. She pulled Scarlett and Isabel behind her, her voice sharp as she told them to stay close. The men called her by name, asking if she was the woman connected to Ethan Hale. Her blood ran cold. It was Ethan's world bleeding into hers, a world she had fought so hard to escape. One of the men advanced, his tone low and menacing, as he told her that Ethan owed favors, that he had left loose ends. Chloe could barely breathe as she tried to shield her daughters, but before she could answer, another voice cut through the night. Ethan rounded the corner, his figure tall and imposing even against the snow. His coat was open, his hair damp from the storm, his expression a mixture of fury and protectiveness she had never seen before. He yelled at the men to leave, his voice carrying the authority that once commanded boardrooms. But now it burned with something more primal. The twins clung to Chloe, their eyes wide, but Ethan was already moving forward, positioning himself between them and the threat. The men exchanged sharp words with him, but his body was unyielding. His stance daring them to try to touch what was now his, was to protect. Chloe had seen him give orders to board members and investors, but this was different. It was raw, dangerous, the kind of determination that came from love, not ambition. When one of the men stepped forward as if to challenge him, Ethan lunged. The fight was short but violent, snow flying up beneath their feet as Ethan's fists impacted his opponent. Years of pent-up anger erupted, this time not for pride, but for his family. The other man quickly backed away, realizing they had underestimated him. In moments they retreated to their car, their mumbled threats lost in the roar of the engine as they sped off into the storm. Silence fell, broken only by the heavy sound of Ethan's breathing. He turned to Chloe, his face bruised and scraped, but his eyes steady. Chloe's body shook as the adrenaline drained away, the girls clinging tightly to her legs. For a long moment, she couldn't speak, her throat tight with the terror of what had almost happened. Then Ethan crouched down, scooping the twins into his arms, holding them tightly as they cried into his coat. His voice was low and soothing as he promised they were safe, that nothing and no one would ever hurt them. Chloe watched him, her heart torn between the fear and something far more dangerous, the realization that he meant it. He would fight for them, not with words, not with empty promises, but with his own body if necessary. Later, when the girls were safely tucked in bed, Chloe finally confronted him. Her voice trembled with rage and fear as she demanded to know what kind of life he was dragging them into, if this was just the beginning of more danger. Ethan didn't defend himself or minimize what had happened. He admitted the truth, that his world had always been ruthless, that his decisions had created enemies, but that he had now chosen her and the girls above everything else. He told her he would cut ties, burn bridges, walk away from it all if that's what it took to protect them. His face was earnest, his hands shaking as he reached for hers, and for the first time, she saw not the millionaire CEO, but a man stripped bare, humbled, and most of all, determined to choose love over pride. Chloe pulled her hands away, pacing the small room, her mind in chaos. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let her heart soften at the sight of his vulnerability, but the memories of abandonment still burned too fiercely. Yet, when she looked at him, bruised from a fight he didn't need to fight, but had chosen to for them, and when she thought of the way Scarlett and Isabel had clung to him for safety, she realized she could no longer deny that he was changing. He had crossed the line from words to actions, and though her trust was not yet whole, a piece of her heart moved toward him in that moment. That night, Chloe barely slept, her thoughts tangled between fear and fragile hope. She understood now that Ethan's presence in their lives was no longer a question of whether she would allow it. The girls had already claimed him as their father, and fate had made it clear that he was willing to fight for that role with everything he had. The only question left was whether she was strong enough to open the door that he once closed so cruelly, knowing that this time, if it opened, it might never close again. The spring of forgiveness and rebuilding. The snow began to melt slowly as spring edged closer to the mountains, leaving behind crystalline streams of water snaking down the slopes. The days grew longer, and with them came a strange sense of renewal that Chloe couldn't ignore. She watched Scarlett and Isabel chase each other across the grass near the diner, their giggles ringing like bells, while Ethan stood nearby, his eyes fixed on them with an expression that conveyed pride and awe. Weeks had passed since that night when strangers threatened their fragile peace, and though the fear still lingered in Chloe's memory, what remained stronger was the image of Ethan interposing himself in danger, his body bruised but unyielding. It was that moment, more than any of his apologies, that forced her to accept that he was not the same man who had cast her out. He had been tested, and he had chosen his family. Still, the scars of the past did not fade easily. Chloe often woke up in the middle of the night, her heart pounding from old terrors, recalling the slam of the mansion door and the sound of his voice telling her, "Don't come back." She struggled to reconcile the man who had thrown her into the darkness with the man who now sat at her kitchen table, patiently braiding the twins' hair or quietly mending their broken toys, with hands unaccustomed to such delicate work. She wondered if people could truly change, or if Ethan's newfound devotion was only temporary, born of guilt and the novelty of discovery. Yet every day he returned, and every day he showed her and the girls with his actions, more than his words, that he was determined to stay. One afternoon, after clocking out from her shift at the diner, Chloe walked home with the girls and found Ethan waiting for her by the small wooden fence of their apartment. The air was soft with the first hints of spring, and the street lanterns flickered warmly. He looked nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to the other in a manner so unlike the confident CEO she remembered. When the girls ran to him, hugging his waist, Chloe saw his face light up with a pure joy that startled her. He scooped them up into his arms, listening to their chatter as if every word they uttered was a treasure. It was then that Chloe felt her heart soften against her will, for there was no performance in the way he looked at them. There was only love, an irreversible decision. Later that evening, after the twins were asleep tangled in their small bed, Ethan asked Chloe to sit with him outside, under the fading stars. She hesitated, wary of what he might say. But curiosity and a gentle tug at her heart led her to join him. They sat in silence at first, the cool air carrying the faint scent of pine, until he finally turned to her. His voice was steady yet vulnerable as he told her he was done pretending he could live two lives. He had already begun cutting ties with the corporate world that had consumed him, stepping down from the empire he had once guarded so fiercely, because he realized that no fortune or title could ever replace what he had lost with her. He admitted he was scared that she would never fully forgive him. But he was willing to spend the rest of his life proving he deserved a place in their family. Chloe listened, her hands clasped in her lap, her mind divided between disbelief and the pull of sincerity in his words. For years, she had built her life on distrust of him, teaching herself that he was the door forever closed. Yet looking into his eyes that night, she didn't see the arrogance that once defined him. She saw a man stripped bare, humbled, desperate, and above all, determined to choose love over pride. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke, telling him that forgiveness was not something she could give lightly, that the wounds he left would never entirely vanish. But she conceded that she no longer hated him, that seeing him with Scarlett and Isabel had shown her a side of him she didn't believe existed. She confessed that a part of her still loved him, though she had tried to bury that love beneath years of pain, and that maybe, just maybe, she was ready to stop fighting the possibility of healing. Ethan took her hand then, not with force, but with the gentleness of a man fearful she might withdraw it. This time, she didn't. The yes and the open future weeks taught, Ethan surprised them all. He arranged a small gathering in the garden behind the diner where Chloe worked, a place filled with wild flowers and soft sunlight. Only a few townsfolk, people who had become part of Chloe's quiet life, attended, and the twins, who wore matching dresses and carried tiny baskets of petals. When Ethan stood before Chloe with a simple ring, his voice cracked as he asked her to marry him, not as the man who once scorned her, but as the man who now knew her worth and the value of the family they had created. Chloe felt tears stream down her cheeks as she whispered yes, not because she had forgotten the past, but because she had chosen to believe in the future. Their wedding was simple, filled with laughter and earnestness rather than grandeur. Scarlett and Isabel ran through the garden, scattering petals in their wake, their joy a symbol of everything that had brought Chloe and Ethan back together. When the vows were exchanged, there were no empty promises of perfection, only a solemn oath to choose each other every day, to stand together in both the darkness and the light. As Ethan kissed Chloe beneath the setting sun, the twins squealed with delight and launched themselves into their arms, and the four of them held each other tightly, as if afraid to ever let go again. For Chloe, the moment felt like the closing of a long, painful chapter and the beginning of something fragile, yet beautiful. She knew life would never be without its difficulties, but as she looked at Ethan and her daughters, she felt a peace she hadn't known since before the mansion door slammed shut. The man who once told her, "Don't come back," had returned in her place, humbled and transformed, and she had allowed herself to open the door to him one more time. This time, she knew, it would stay open, and together they would build the home and the love they once lost.